In recent interviews published by The Atlantic, former Attorney General Bill Barr says Donald Trump's election fraud claims were BS. Barr told the publication, if there was evidence of fraud, I had no motive to suppress it.
Now, despite there being no evidence of widespread voter fraud in the 2020 election, some voters still believe Biden did not win legitimately. A recent Monmouth poll found 32% of voters said Biden won due to election fraud.
A new exclusive Hill-HarrisX survey asks a similar question. Let's take a look.
Said all along, it's not my place or Donald Trump's place to declare who's won this election. That's the decision of the American people.
This is a major fraud in our nation. We want the law to be used in a proper manner. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court.
So 55% of voters say Biden won legitimately, while 27% said election fraud, including 56% of Republicans and 20% of independents. Ryan, what do you make of the survey?
Well, my favorite part might be the 5% of Democrats who say that it was by voter fraud.
Right, it's Jill Stein.
They're like, yeah, it was us. It was us. We did this. I mean, it's kind of a shocking poll in one respect. In another, it's in line with what we've what we've been seeing, the trend developing among Republicans and among the electorate in general. Democrats were not immune to questioning the legitimacy of the previous election, but they didn't believe that the votes were changed at the ballot box. Trump still says to this day, they found hundreds of thousands of votes in Philadelphia between 2 and 5 a.m. Well, yes, of course they did. They count the votes after right. The election, and you think that that's such an obvious point. Yet here are more than half of Republicans, 20% of independents. Those are they're Republicans, but they like to think of themselves as independents. They hear that claim and they're like, yeah, they found all these votes in Georgia and Arizona and Pennsylvania, and where'd they all come from? And we were winning, and then all of a sudden we were losing.
But a lot of this is Donald Trump's fault, but a lot of the reason that his message actually works is because of institutional failure, and that's what gives his message legs when it hits people. They have nobody to trust, and so somebody who says you can't trust anybody else, they're technically correct, and so then people think they can trust them, and it's sad, but it is an entirely reasonable position for a lot of people whose profession isn't politics to make. And that's, again, it's a sad thing. And this is sort of a characteristic problem with Donald Trump, is that he latches onto something like the very evergreen existence of election fraud. It happens every election to some scale, and then blows it into something that explicitly says that widespread fraud is what caused the election. And we're parsing then all of these very real examples of problems in our electoral system, but they get blown into the scale because nobody knows what to believe in terms of the scale. Nobody knows what to believe in terms of the facts. It's actually really hard, even if you do work in politics now, to find sources that are legitimate and trustworthy. Also because people don't do as much fact checking. I mean, the layers of fact checking are completely different than they used to be. And so finding reliable information is as difficult as ever. And that's where people like Donald Trump, I think, are able to exploit the problems of institutional failure and the lack of trust in the country.
There's also a lot of cowardice going on as well. Bill Barr telling The Atlantic now in June that he didn't find any fraud. Okay, thanks, Bill Barr, in June of 2021 for sharing that. You could have spoken up publicly in November, December, January, when it would have actually mattered. Same with Mitch McConnell. There's that famous quote that was given to the Washington Post, that a Republican member of Congress saying, why bother with Trump? Like, who's it really going to hurt? Let him have his little fantasy for a few weeks. It's not that big of a deal. Nobody's going to believe it anyway. What's the harm? So people are constantly making these cost-benefit calculations about whether now is the moment to speak up on behalf of what they know to be true, or whether they should just let this one slide. And now it's slid all the way to 56% of Republicans, which now creates a political incentive for candidates to run on the idea in Republican primaries that the election was stolen, which, as we talked about previously in the show, probably hurt Republicans in the suburbs of Atlanta in the special election, and would probably hurt them again, because 56% of Republicans is a lot, but it's not a majority of the country.
Right. And we're not even on the cusp of recognizing what it means that 56% of Republicans think that an election was stolen. I remember on January 6th reporting and talking to people who were there at the protest before it turned into a riot. I was talking to people who had never voted before, and they voted for Donald Trump, and their loyalties were to Donald Trump. That's what happened. And so you have a wide swath of this country that believes Trump over all else, and that's going to influence Republican politics, I think, in a very negative way. There are some, there are some politicians who are trying to perfect the balance and trying to walk that line, which is almost impossible. And political memories in this country are short. Everybody kind of understands that. But at the same time, it's not just about Trump. This is about institutional distrust. And I talk a lot about how the left likes to inflate definitions, or the left gets sort of intimidated into saying things that people don't necessarily agree with on cultural issues. But the same thing is basically happening here. I think it's kind of a function of polarization, that there are incentives on both sides to respond to people responding to institutional distrust and institutional failure in their bases, don't believe anything, get sort of pulled in unfortunate directions. And the more that we wink and nod at those things, the more that we create this artificial reality of what's real and what's not. And we live in an artificial reality then. Yeah, and the erosion of trust only builds over time. I think it is absolutely fair to say that Democrats stole 1960. JFK stole the 1960 election in both Texas and Illinois. In 2000, when Republicans stole back the election, a lot of Republicans said, this is payback. Mm-hmm. There's a 40-year gap between that. So the Republicans who were in their 60s and 70s experienced 1960. And so they felt like that this was payback. Then in 2016, you have Democrats saying, well, this president is not legitimate. Russia did this. Putin put this guy in the White House. 2020, all the votes were changed. So in 2024, I don't think Republicans would have any compunction about straight up stealing it and feeling like what they were doing was justified because it was payback, even if they don't believe the story by then. And on a presidential scale, that's sort of the worst of our politics. And you make a good point that, I said this was going to affect Republican politics in a very negative way, but institutional distrust is not partisan. There are people being pulled into it, and that's exactly what Hillary Clinton, by the way, who's considered the sort of sane saint of the Democratic Party, stuff she was saying about Russia is insane. She was saying just flat out crazy stuff, and probably still is. It's like utter nonsense, and she's preying on the same institutional distrust that is, I think, also it's a function of partisanship, but primarily the most important way to see it is as a function of institutional failure. The media has failed people for years. The political establishment has failed people for years. So none of this is surprising, and the only way to reckon with it is to take drastic and uncomfortable steps here in the Beltway to make things different. But I have, I'm sure you share this, zero confidence in that happening. And Hillary's podcast is now completely unhinged. She was wondering whether Putin ordered Trump to order an insurrection on January 6th. Like she had Pelosi on, and that was what she discussed with Nancy Pelosi on her podcast. This is what has become of the Wellesley Goldwater girl. There you go. I was disappointed in that one. Yeah. Well, tomorrow on Rising, Brianna Joy Gray is here along with Washington Post White House reporter for economics, Jeff Stein. Team Rising is also back. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We will see you tomorrow. Have a great Tuesday, everyone.